It started as just another mundane night at the 24-hour supermarket where I worked. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ran until 6 a.m., a quiet stretch of hours when only a few late-night shoppers wandered the aisles. It was monotonous, but I preferred it to dealing with the chaos of the day shift. That night, however, something felt off. As I clocked in, the usual hum of fluorescent lights and the faint murmur of the store's music system felt unusually oppressive. The aisles were eerily quiet, even for a night shift. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to fatigue, and headed to the back room to grab my stocking cart. By 11:30, I was in aisle 9, restocking boxes of cereal. That's when I noticed him. A man in a black hoodie stood at the far end of the aisle, facing away from me. I greeted him with a polite, "Good evening," but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned the corner and disappeared into the next aisle. Something about him made my skin crawl. His movements were too smooth, almost gliding. Shaking it off as paranoia, I finished restocking and moved on. An hour later, I was in aisle 5 when I caught sight of him again. This time, he was standing completely still at the far end, staring directly at me. My breath hitched as I noticed his face. It was pale, unnaturally so, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow faintly under the harsh lights. His lips were pressed into a thin, straight line. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. He turned and walked away, disappearing behind the shelves again. By 2 a.m., my unease had grown into full-blown paranoia. The man had appeared on and off, always in my peripheral vision, always disappearing before I could fully confront him. I checked the security cameras in the manager's office, hoping to catch sight of him. To my shock, the footage showed him lingering in aisles I hadn't even been near yet. What was he doing? Determined to put an end to the creeping fear, I decided to find him and escort him out of the store. As I patrolled the aisles, the oppressive silence seemed to grow heavier. The store's music system had stopped playing at some point, and the hum of the lights was now a faint buzz that made my ears ring. In aisle 9, I found him. He stood facing the shelves, unmoving. My footsteps echoed unnaturally as I approached him. "Sir, the store is closed for the night. You need to leave," I said firmly. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned around slowly. My heart stopped. His face, it wasn't right. His eyes were black voids, his mouth unnaturally wide, stretching into a grotesque grin. He took a step toward me and I stumbled back. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I needed to get away. I bolted down the aisles, the shelves blurring around me. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I heard footsteps behind me, impossibly fast and heavy. The freezer section was the only place I could think to hide. I ducked into one of the massive walk-in freezers and slammed the door shut, locking it from the inside. The freezing air burned my lungs as I crouched in the corner, trying to quiet my frantic breathing. Then I heard it, a low, guttural laugh. The lights in the freezer flickered and went out. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak flashlight to illuminate the space around me. My breath froze in the air as I scanned the room. He was there, standing in the corner, his black eyes glinting in the faint light. I screamed. He lunged at me, but just as his fingers brushed my arm, the freezer lights came back on. He was gone. I stumbled out of the freezer and into the store, only to find it completely silent. The clock on the wall read 6 a.m. My shift was over. Shaking, I rushed to the manager's office to report what had happened. But when I checked the security footage, there was no sign of the man, no evidence he'd ever been there. I quit that night. A week later, I got a call from one of my former coworkers. She asked if I'd been in the store after my shift. I told her I hadn't. "Well," she said hesitantly, "someone who looked just like you was caught on camera, standing in aisle 9. My first night alone at the radio station was supposed to be uneventful. The previous host, Dale, had finished his shift and given me the usual rundown before leaving. Play the tracks on the playlist, read the ads at the scheduled times, and answer the occasional call if it came through. It was a quiet gig, perfect for someone who didn't mind being alone in the small, soundproofed studio. The station was tucked on the edge of town, surrounded by miles of forest. The isolation didn't bother me until that night. It started around midnight. I had just finished reading an ad for a local diner and was queuing up the next track when the phone rang. The old rotary phone sat on the desk beside the soundboard, and its shrill ring cut through the quiet room. "WNTR radio, you're on the air," I said, putting on my best friendly voice. There was a pause, then a faint crackling sound. Finally, a woman's voice came through, soft and almost melodic. "Can you play my favorite song?" "Sure," I replied, grabbing a notepad. "What's the song?" There was another pause before she said, "It's Midnight Lullaby by Josephine Grant." I frowned. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. "I'll see if we have it in the library. Thanks for calling." The line went dead without a goodbye. I searched the station's music library but couldn't find the song. Frustrated, I chalked it up to a prank call. As the night went on, I tried to shake off the strange request. At 1:30 a.m., the phone rang again. WNTR radio, I said cautiously. It was her again. Did you find my song? Her voice sent a chill down my spine. There was something unnatural about it, a hollow, echoing quality, as though it wasn't coming from a phone, but from somewhere much farther away. I'm sorry, I said. We don't have that song in our library. You have to find it, she said softly. I need to hear it. Before I could respond, the line went dead again. I leaned back in my chair, my heart racing. Something wasn't right. I decided to search online for the song. It didn't take long to find it. A jazz tune from the 1940s. The artist, Josephine Grant, had been a rising star before she died in a car accident on her way to a performance. I froze when I saw the date of her death, January 12th, 1947. Tonight's date. I tried to laugh it off as a coincidence, but my hands trembled as I loaded a track that matched the description. Maybe this was some elaborate tribute or a fan keeping her memory alive. When I played the song, the room seemed to change. The air grew heavier, and the faint smell of flowers, lilies, filled the studio. The song was hauntingly beautiful, Josephine's voice smooth and mournful. As the track played, the lights in the studio flickered. The phone rang again. I hesitated before answering. WNTR radio, I said, my voice shaking. This time the voice wasn't soft. It was sharp, angry. Why did you play that? I thought it was your request, I stammered. No, the voice hissed. It wasn't for you. The line went dead and the studio lights went out completely. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the control panel. I stood frozen in the darkness, listening. The song ended, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Then, from the hallway outside the studio, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. Hello? I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the studio door. I didn't dare move. The door creaked open. A woman stood there, silhouetted by the faint emergency light from the hallway. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, and her mouth curled into a faint smile. Thank you for playing my song, she said. Before I could respond, she stepped back into the hallway and vanished into the darkness. When the lights came back on, I was alone. The clock read 6 a.m. My shift was over, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the studio until the sun was fully up. I quit the job that morning. A week later, I got a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a vinyl record labeled Midnight Lullaby by Josephine Grant. Scrawled on the cover in faded ink were the words, "For you." The night shift as a city taxi driver had its perks. No traffic, steady fares, and a strange sense of freedom that came with navigating quiet streets under the glow of dim streetlight. But it also had its risks. Drunks, troublemakers, and the occasional unsettling passenger were all part of the job. I thought I'd seen it all, until her. It was just after 2 a.m., and my shift was nearing its end. I was cruising down an empty avenue, debating whether to call it a night, when my dispatcher sent a ping, a pickup request from a residential area on the outskirts of town. I considered ignoring it. The neighborhood was old, run down, and known for being a little rough. But the fare was good, and I figured I could handle one last ride. When I pulled up to the address, the house was dark. It looked abandoned, with peeling paint, boarded up windows, and a yard overrun with weeds. The only sign of life was a woman standing at the curb, clutching a small black handbag. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, the kind you'd see in vintage photos, and her dark hair was pinned neatly under a hat. Her face was pale, almost unnaturally so, but she had an air of calm elegance that put me at ease. "Good evening," I said as she slid into the back seat. "Good evening," she replied, her voice soft and formal. "Where to?" She handed me a slip of paper with an address written in neat, flowing script. It was on the other side of town, a good 30-minute drive. As we started off, I tried to make small talk. "Late night, huh? Busy day?" She didn't answer, just stared out the window. Her silence was unsettling, but I didn't press. Some people just wanted a quiet ride. The drive was uneventful at first, but as we got farther from the city center, I started to notice things. The temperature in the cab dropped, and no matter how high I turned up the heat, it stayed freezing. A faint scent of lavender filled the air, sharp and sickly sweet. When I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, she was staring directly at me. Her eyes, which had seemed normal at first, now looked dark and hollow, deep, empty wells. "Are you all right?" I asked, gripping the wheel tighter. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You don't recognize me, do you?" "Recognize you?" I stammered. "No, I don't think so." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You've taken this route before." I frowned, trying to focus on the road. Her words felt heavy, like they carried a meaning I couldn't grasp. As we neared the address she'd given me, I realized it wasn't in a residential area. It was an abandoned industrial district. The buildings were crumbling, their windows shattered, and the streetlights flickered weakly. "This is the place?" I asked, pulling up to a derelict warehouse. "Yes," she said, her voice suddenly distant. She didn't move to get out. Instead, she leaned forward, her face partially obscured by the shadow of her hat. "Do you remember now?" I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking. Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. "You drove me here once before, but you didn't take me home." The memory hit me like a freight train. Months ago, I had a passenger who looked just like her. She'd asked to be taken to the same location, but when we arrived, she was gone. No payment, no sign she'd ever been in the car. I'd brushed it off as a strange glitch in my tired brain. You can't be her." Her laughter was soft and chilling. "But I am, and you left me." I glanced back at her, but it was empty. The air in the cab grew unbearably cold, and frost began to creep across the windows. Panicking, I tried to start the engine, but it stalled. The dashboard lights flickered as a low whisper filled the car, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You left me behind," the voice hissed. "Now, it's your turn." The last thing I remember was a blinding light and the sensation of being pulled backward. I woke up the next morning in my cab, parked on the side of a busy street. My phone buzzed with missed calls and message from my dispatcher, asking where I'd been. When I checked the fare log, there was no record of the trip. The address she'd given me didn't exist, and the cash she'd left on the seat was gone. But the faint smell of lavender lingered, and every time I drive past that old industrial district, I feel her eyes on me, waiting for her next ride. The small-town hospital where I worked as a security guard wasn't particularly busy, especially on the night shift. Most of the activity came from a handful of emergency cases or the occasional patient wandering the halls. It was routine, quiet, and predictable. At least that's what I thought until the night everything changed. It was a little after 2 a.m. and I was doing my usual rounds. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead and the hallways were empty except for the faint hum of medical equipment. The air was heavy with the sterile smell of disinfectant. As I turned a corner near the old wing of the hospital, I noticed something strange. One of the doors, marked Room 217, was slightly ajar. The thing is, that wing had been closed for years. It used to house long-term patients, but budget cuts and newer facilities had left it abandoned. The rooms were empty, and no one had any reason to go there. Frowning, I approached the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty corridor. No response. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the dusty window. The bed was neatly made, the sheets yellowed with age. A few pieces of outdated medical equipment sat in the corner, covered in cobwebs. That's when I saw her. A woman stood by the window, her back to me. She wore a faded hospital gown, her long hair hanging limp over her shoulders. "Ma'am, you're not supposed to be here," I said, keeping my voice calm. She didn't respond. "Are you lost?" I took a cautious step closer, my flashlight beam trembling as I aimed it at her. She turned slowly and my breath caught in my throat. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and rimmed with dark shadows. But it was her expression that truly unnerved me. A vacant, sorrowful, as if she was barely aware of her surroundings. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help me find my baby." A chill ran down my spine. "Your baby?" I asked, my voice shaky. She nodded, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. "They took her. I can't find her." I didn't know what to say. My instinct told me to call for backup, but something about her desperation kept me rooted to the spot. "Who took her?" I asked. "The nurses," she said, her voice breaking. "They said she didn't make it, but I heard her crying. I know she's here." My stomach turned. This couldn't be happening. "Ma'am, let me help you," I said, stepping closer. But before I could reach her, the room grew colder, freezing, like I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. My breath puffed out invisible clouds, and the lights flickered wildly. The woman's eyes widened, and she let out a heart-wrenching scream that echoed through the room. The sound was so piercing, so filled with anguish, that I dropped my flashlight. When the lights steadied, she was gone. I stumbled out of the room, my heart racing. My radio crackled to life, startling me. "Everything okay down there?" my coworker asked. I hesitated, my mouth dry. "Yeah," I lied. "Just a false alarm." The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the image of the woman. The next day, curiosity got the better of me, and I started digging into the hospital's records. It didn't take long to find a story about a patient from decades ago, a young woman named Clara who had been admitted to room 217. She'd given birth prematurely, and the baby had died shortly after delivery. Claire had refused to believe it, insisting the nurses had taken her baby. She'd spent her final days wandering the hospital, searching for her child, before dying of a heart attack in that very room. They said she haunted the old wing, but I'd never believed it, until now. Even now, when I walk past the old wing, I can't help but feel her presence. Sometimes, I think I hear faint cries coming from room 217 or catch a glimpse of a shadow by the window. I've tried to convince myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know she's still searching, and I pray she never finds me. Working the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store was supposed to be an easy gig. Stock some shelves, ring up the occasional late-night customer, and spend the rest of the time scrolling through my phone. But the store's location, just off a desolate stretch of highway surrounded by dense woods, gave it an eerie vibe. Most nights were uneventful, the monotony broken only by truckers grabbing coffee or teenagers sneaking snacks. But that night, the night I'll never forget, was different. It started around 1 a.m. I was restocking the fridge with sodas when the motion sensor at the door chimed. I peeked over the shelf to see who had entered, but the store was empty. Thinking it was a glitch, I shrugged it off and returned to work. Then, as I reached for another pack of sodas, I felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned around, my eyes scanning the aisles. Still, no one was there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the quiet store. No response. Shaking my head, I told myself I was being paranoid. I grabbed my phone and checked the store's security cameras. The screen showed the front door opening and closing on its own, as if an invisible force had tripped the sensor. That's when I noticed something else. In the camera feed for aisle 3, a shadow darted across the frame. Quick, barely noticeable, but definitely there. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. The aisles were empty when I'd looked just moments ago. I stepped out from behind the counter, hesitant but determined to prove to myself that nothing was wrong. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as I walked down each aisle. Everything was where it should be. No shadow, no sign of anyone. When I reached aisle 3, though, I froze. There, on the floor, was a single item that hadn't been there before. A doll. It was old, its face cracked and faded, its clothes tattered. It looked like something out of a horror movie. I bent down to pick it up, but as soon as my fingers brushed the porcelain surface, the store lights flickered. A chill swept through the air, and the motion sensor chimed again. I spun around, expecting to see someone at the door, but the entrance was empty. Instead, a figure stood at the far end of the aisle, a woman in a long black dress, her hair hanging over her face. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. She didn't move. I backed away slowly, clutching the doll in one hand. When I reached the counter, I grabbed the phone to call my manager, but the line was dead. The store's clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching into eternity. When I looked back, the woman was gone. I locked the front door and decided to wait out the rest of my shift behind the counter. My eyes darted between the security monitors in the store, watching for any sign of movement. Around 3 a.m., the lights flickered again. This time, they went out completely, plunging the store into darkness. The emergency lights kicked in, casting the aisles in an eerie red glow. The doll, which I had left on the counter, was gone. I heard soft footsteps. Turning slowly, I came face to face with her. Hair parted slightly, revealing hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched into an unnatural grin. "Why did you take her?" she whispered, her voice raspy and distorted. Take who?" I stammered, backing away. She pointed to the empty counter where the doll had been. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice barely audible. She moved closer, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The air grew colder with each step she took. "You took her from me," she hissed. "Give her back." Before I could respond, she reached out, her cold, bony fingers brushing my arm. A searing pain shot through me, and I collapsed to the floor. When I woke up, the sun was rising and the store was empty. The doll was back on the counter, staring at me with its cracked, lifeless eyes. I quit that morning, leaving the keys on the counter and walking away without a word. I've heard stories about that stretch of highway, about accidents, disappearances, and a woman in black who haunts the area. I don't know if I encountered a ghost or something worse that night, but I'll never forget the look in her eyes, and I'll never step foot in that store again. The graveyard shift as a hotel receptionist wasn't glamorous, but it had its perks: peace and quiet, a steady paycheck, and plenty of time to kill during the long, lonely hours. The hotel itself wasn't much to look at, a 3-story old-fashioned building on the outskirts of town, but it rarely had issues. That night started like any other. The lobby was dimly lit, the faint hum of the vending machine, the only sound breaking the silence. I was flipping through a magazine when the phone rang. It startled me. Calls after midnight were rare, and something about the shrill sound and the stillness set me on edge. "Front desk," I answered, forcing my voice to sound calm and professional. At first, there was silence. Then, a faint static-laced voice whispered, "Room 309. "Excuse me?" I asked, leaning closer to the receiver. "Room 309, the voice repeated. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my stomach twisting. Room 309 was supposed to be vacant. I double-checked the computer system just to be sure, and yes, the room was unoccupied. Thinking it was a prank, I brushed it off and returned to my magazine, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. Minutes later, the elevator dinged. I looked up, expecting to see a guest returning from a night out. Instead, the elevator doors slid open to reveal an empty car. My pulse quickened. Maybe it was a glitch, I told myself. Maybe someone had pressed the button by accident. But when the doors closed and the elevator ascended, stopping on the third floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Grabbing the master keycard, I decided to check it out. The fluorescent lights in the hallway buzzed softly as I stepped off the elevator onto the third floor. The air felt heavier up there and the silence was oppressive. Room 309 was at the end of the hall. As I approached, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. A faint, cold draft wafted through the gap. "Hello," I called out, pushing the door open wider. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. The bed was untouched, the linens crisp and clean. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. The phone receiver was off the hook, dangling by its cord. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped inside, flipping on the light. The room felt wrong, cold and heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I picked up the phone and placed it back on the cradle. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the bathroom. My heart pounded as I approached the closed door. The whispering grew louder, though I couldn't make out the words. "Someone in there?" I asked, my voice trembling. No response. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I forced myself to turn the knob and push the door open. The bathroom was empty. I exhaled shakily, relief flooding through me. But as I turned to leave, I caught something in the mirror, a shadowy figure standing behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The whispering returned, louder now, filling my ears. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. When I reached the lobby, I was gasping for air. The phone at the front desk rang again, making me jump. With trembling hands, I picked it up. "Room 309, the same static-laced voice whispered. I slammed the phone down and unplugged it from the wall. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I sat behind the desk, refusing to leave the lobby, my eyes glued to the security monitor. The next morning, I told the day shift manager what had happened. She gave me a strange look and pulled out a thick binder of old incident reports. "There's a reason we don't rent out room 309, she said, flipping through the pages. "Years ago, a man died in that room. Some kind of violent altercation. Ever since, strange things have been happening up there." She closed the binder and sighed. "You're not the first to report hearing whispers or seeing shadows. We keep it listed as vacant to avoid any complication." I quit that afternoon. Even now, years later, I can't stay in hotels without feeling a prickling unease, because every time I pass an empty hallway or hear a phone ring in the distance, I think about room 309, and I wonder if it's still waiting for someone to answer. The gas station I worked at during the night shift was a lonely, isolated spot, surrounded by nothing but a few trees and endless stretches of highway. It was the kind of place that felt suspended in time, like the world outside didn't exist once the sun went down. Most nights were quiet. A few truckers would roll in for coffee and fuel, and maybe the occasional stranded driver looking for directions. But that night was different. That night, I learned how thin the veil between the ordinary and the horrifying could be. It was just after 2 a.m., and I was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. The gas station was empty, and the only sounds were the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Then, the bell over the door jingled. I looked up, expecting a customer, but the door hadn't opened. Frowning, I stepped out from behind the counter and looked around. The door was shut, the parking lot empty. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was a gust of wind or the old bell acting up. As I turned to head back, the sound came again. This time, it was faint, like the jingling of keys. It came from the far end of the station, near the storage room. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No response. I grabbed the flashlight we kept under the counter and made my way toward the sound. The storage room door was slightly ajar, and a faint cold draft was seeping through the crack. "Is someone in there?" I asked, my hand tightening around the flashlight. Still nothing. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and shined the flashlight inside. The storage room was small, packed with boxes of snacks, cleaning supplies, and other inventory. Everything looked normal, except for the keys. They were lying in the middle of the floor, gleaming under the beam of my flashlight. I picked them up, frowning. They weren't mine, and they didn't belong to the gas station. The keyring was old and rusted, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in an antique shop. As I examined them, the air around me grew colder. A shiver ran down my spine, and I had the unsettling sensation of being watched. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. Trying to shake off the unease, I pocketed the keys and returned to the front of the store. I was halfway to the counter when the lights flickered. I froze. The lights dimmed again, then went out completely, plunging the store into darkness. My flashlight wavered in my hand as I scanned the room, the beam cutting through the oppressive blackness. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the light, just outside the glow of the flashlight. It was tall and humanoid, but its features were wrong. Elongated limbs, a hunched posture, and a face that seemed to shift and ripple like water. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, locked onto me. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. It tilted its head as if studying me. Then, in a low, gravelly voice, it said, "You shouldn't have taken them." My hand flew to my pocket, where the keys were. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "They weren't yours to take," it hissed. I pulled the keys out and held them up. "Take them back," I yelled. The figure stopped, its head tilting again. Then, with an unnatural, jerking motion, it extended a long, skeletal hand. I tossed the keys toward it, and they clattered to the floor. The figure bent down, picking them up with fingers that seemed too many and too long. As soon as the keys were in its grasp, the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone. I stood there, my body trembling, staring at the spot where it had been. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I locked the storage room door and stayed behind the counter, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. When my shift ended at sunrise, I told my manager about what had happened. He gave me a strange look and said, "You're not the first to see something in the storage room. We've had people quit over it." I never worked another night shift at that gas station. But sometimes, when I'm driving down an empty stretch of highway late at night, I think about those keys and the figure that came for them, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't given them back. The diner where I worked the night shift was perched on a lonely stretch of highway, surrounded by nothing but fields and the occasional shadowy outline of trees. It was the kind of place people stopped at, only when they had no other choice. By midnight, the booths were empty, the jukebox silent, and the fluorescent lights cast a pale, unflattering glow over the cracked tiles. I didn't mind the quiet nights. They gave me time to catch up on cleaning or bury myself in a good book. But that night was different. That night, something came into the diner that shouldn't have. It was around 2 a.m. when the bell above the door jinged. I looked up from my crossword puzzle, expecting to see a trucker or a tired traveler. Instead, a man walked in. At first, there didn't seem to be anything unusual about him. He was tall, wearing a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather, and a hat pulled low over his face. But as he stepped into the light, I noticed something odd. His face was pale, unnaturally, and his eyes were shadowed, like they were sunken too deep into his skull. "Evening," I said, forcing a smile. He didn't respond. He simply walked to the counter and sat down on one of the stools. "What can I get you?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful despite the unease creeping up my spine. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the menu, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was unfamiliar with how menus worked. Finally, he said, in a voice that was raspy and dry, "Coffee, black." I nodded and poured him a cup, setting it down in front of him. He didn't touch it, just stared at it, like it held some kind of secret. "Long night?" I asked, attempting small talk. He tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You could say that." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I busied myself wiping the counter, trying to avoid looking at it, but I couldn't help it. There was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. After a few minutes, he finally lifted the coffee cup to his lips. As he drank, I noticed his hand. It was pale, like the rest of him, but there was something else. His fingers were too long, almost skeletal, and his nails looked sharp, more like claws than anything human. I felt my stomach twist. "You get a lot of people stopping here this late?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Not really," I said, forcing myself to sound casual. "Just the occasional trucker or someone passing through." He nodded, his expression unreadable. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Do they always leave?" I stared at him, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" He smiled again, wider this time. "Do they always make it to where they're going?" I felt my heart race. Yeah, I guess. Why wouldn't they?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, leaving his coffee untouched. "Well," he said, adjusting his hat, "thanks for the coffee." I nodded, unable to find my voice. He turned and walked toward the door. But just before he stepped outside, he stopped and looked back at me. "Be careful out here," he said. "Not everything on the road is what it seems." Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I moved to clear his cup, hoping to shake off the unease. That's when I noticed it. On the counter, where he had been sitting, was a small, dark stain. It looked like blood. I wiped it up, but no matter how much I scrubbed, the stain wouldn't come off. The rest of the night passed in a blur, and when the sun finally rose, I left the diner without saying a word. I quit the next day. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I think about that man and his strange, unsettling question, and I wonder if he was warning me, or if he was just letting me know what happens to people who stay out on the highway after dark. It was my second week working the night shift at the old warehouse on the edge of town. The building had been abandoned for years, and my job was simple. Make sure nothing was disturbed overnight and keep an eye on the security cameras. It was a lonely, desolate place, but the pay was good and I didn't mind the silence. That night, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the atmosphere was heavier than usual. The fluorescent lights flickered in the hallway and the shadows seemed deeper, more suffocating. I chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, I'd been working late shifts for a while now. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Around midnight, the security system's alarm went off. It wasn't loud, just a soft chime, but it sent a wave of dread through me. The system indicated motion detected in the East Wing, an area that had been locked for years. My heart began to race. I double-checked the cameras, but the feed for that section was static, just a blank screen, as if the cameras weren't working at all. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The East Wing was dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of old wood and metal. I tried the door, but it was locked. The key, which I kept on a chain around my neck, was warm to the touch, even though the rest of the building was cold. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was filled with rows of old, rusted equipment and crates covered in thick tarps, but something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I heard a faint scraping sound behind me. Whipping around, I saw nothing, just empty space. My breath came out in quick, uneven gasps as I turned back to the room. Then I heard it again, this time closer. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I spun around, but again the room was still empty. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my chest, my mind racing for an explanation. It had to be the wind or some animal, right? But there was no breeze, no open windows, only the silence, now broken by the growing sound of scraping. I pointed my flashlight toward the far corner of the room. The beam flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls, and that's when I saw it, a figure, standing perfectly still in the corner, its back to me. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, spindly limbs and a hunched back. Its head was turned, but I couldn't see its face, just the shape of it, like a shadow blending into the darkness. I froze. My flashlight flickered once more, and then went out completely. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to turn it back on. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was aware of me, watching me. Finally, the light came back on, and the figure was gone. I backed away toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. But before I could leave, I heard a voice, low, raspy, almost a whisper, coming from the shadows. "Don't leave." I yanked the door open and ran back down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back until I reached the security office. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, my body shaking with fear. I checked the cameras again, but the feed was still blank for the East Wing. I could see nothing on the monitors except the empty halls of the warehouse. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The sound of scraping kept echoing in my mind, the feeling of something watching me lingering in the air. The next day, I told my supervisor what had happened, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. "You're probably just tired. The warehouse is old and things break down." He didn't seem convinced, but I could tell he was hiding something. That night, I went back to work, but I wasn't alone. I was watching the cameras when I saw it again. The figure, standing still in the East Wing. I rushed to the area, my heart pounding in my chest, and this time, I didn't hesitate. I went into the room with the flashlight ready, but the figure wasn't there. The room was empty. I turned to leave, but then I saw something in the corner of my eye, a dark shape moving quickly across the floor, heading toward the crates. I didn't wait. I ran. I quit the job the next morning, never to return. But every now and then, when I walk past an old building or hear a scraping sound in the distance, I remember that tall figure, standing motionless in the dark, and I wonder how many others have seen it too. It was my first night working the graveyard shift at a small, family-owned convenience store in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place that only had a few customers a night, mostly truckers passing through, picking up cigarettes or coffee. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and the owner seemed nice enough, so I wasn't complaining. The store was a bit rundown, with flickering lights and shelves that hadn't been fully stocked in years, but that didn't bother me. It had a certain charm, or so I thought, until that night. Around 1:30 a.m., The bell above the door rang. I looked up from my book to see a man enter, dressed in a dark, worn-out jacket and boots. His face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and the shadows seemed to cling to him, even though the store was well lit. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound friendly, though the hairs on the back of my neck were already standing up. He didn't respond. He just walked to the counter and placed a bottle of water in front of me. I gave him a quick smile and started ringing him up. "Is it just you tonight?" he asked in a low voice, his eyes never meeting mine. I froze. There was something in his tone that made my stomach churn. "Yeah, just me," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "The boss doesn't come in until morning." The man nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled, faded piece of paper. "Do you have this?" he asked, sliding the paper across the counter. I looked down at the paper and my blood ran cold. It was a list of items, seemingly ordinary like chips, candy, and drinks. But at the bottom, there was something strange. A single word, scrawled in black ink. "Help." Before I could respond, the man grabbed the bottle of water and walked toward the door. He didn't pay. "Hey!" I called after him, my heart pounding in my chest. "You forgot to pay!" He didn't stop. He didn't even acknowledge me. My hands trembled as I watched him leave. Something felt off, too off, but I couldn't explain why. I stared at the door, waiting for him to disappear into the night. The moment the door clicked shut, the bell chimed again. I turned around, expecting to see the man walking back in. But instead, there was nothing, except for the feeling. I felt it. Something in the air had changed. The store was colder now, the walls closer. The shadows seemed longer. The silence was deafening. I took a shaky breath and went to lock the door, double-checking that it was secure. But when I turned back, my heart stopped. The man was standing at the far end of the store. I didn't hear him enter, didn't see him walk in. He was just there. "Whoa, what are you doing here?" He didn't answer, just stood there, staring at me. His eyes were empty, hollow, and I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. Then, slowly, his lips curled into a twisted smile. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I stumbled back, fear crashing over me. "What do you mean? You left, you—" But when I looked again, he was gone. I rushed to the door, unlocking it and stepping outside, my heart racing. There was no sign of the man, just the empty parking lot, the streetlights flickering in the distance. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just a trick of the light or exhaustion playing with my mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That's when I noticed something strange. In the corner of the parking lot near the dumpster, there was a dark shape. It looked like a person, hunched over, but they weren't moving. I walked closer, my steps slow and hesitant, my mind telling me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know what it was. When I got closer, I could see it more clearly. It was the man, his back to me. His jacket was torn, and there was something wrong with his posture. His back was bent at an unnatural angle, as if he was twisting into a shape that wasn't human. I called out to him, my voice shaking, but he didn't respond. I took another step forward, and that's when I saw it. His face. It wasn't a face. It was just a mass of twisted, rotting flesh, an open mouth filled with jagged teeth, staring at me like an animal's. His eyes were black holes, voids that seemed to pull everything into them. I froze, my body locked in terror, unable to move. Then, he opened his mouth. The scream that came out of it wasn't human. It was a sound like metal scraping against concrete, like the earth itself was being torn apart. The air turned thick, heavy, suffocating, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The next thing I knew, I was back inside the store, slamming the door shut behind me. I tried to call the police, but when I looked down at my phone, the screen was cracked, the call button frozen. I looked around the store, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The man was gone. The door was locked, the lights flickering back to normal, but I could still feel him, watching from somewhere outside. I couldn't leave, not yet. I spent the rest of the night staring at the door, hoping, praying that I'd make it through until morning. When the sun finally rose, I handed in my keys and walked out for good. I haven't worked at a convenience store since, and every time I pass by one, I wonder if that man is still out there, waiting for someone to open the door. I worked the night shift at a small motel on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet place, far from the city, with only the occasional traveler needing a place to sleep. I had been on the job for a few months and had grown used to the lonesome hours. The old motel had a strange charm to it, but there was something about it that always felt a little off. The walls creaked when the wind blew, and there were always strange noises in the hallway, but I told myself it was just the old building settling. One night, around 2 a.m., the phone rang. I was behind the counter, flipping through a magazine to pass the time. I picked up the receiver, half expecting it to be a late-night reservation or someone asking for directions. "Hello, Motel 7, how can I help you?" I said, trying to sound cheerful despite the weight of exhaustion in my voice. There was a long pause, and just when I was about to hang up, I heard a low voice. "Room 4, it whispered. "Check room 4, I furrowed my brow. "Who is this?" I asked, my tone slightly nervous, but the line went dead. I stared at the receiver in confusion. No one had been there, no one I knew, and I definitely didn't have anyone in room 4 at the moment. My curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to check it out. The hallway was quiet as I made my way to room 4, the dim yellow lights casting long shadows across the floor. I tried to shake the feeling of dread creeping up my spine, but I couldn't. There was something in the air that felt thick, oppressive. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment before knocking. There was no answer. I knocked again, a little louder this, still nothing. Something in my gut told me to turn around and go back, but I couldn't stop myself. I unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, just like I expected, but there was something wrong. The bed was perfectly made. The curtains were drawn tightly, and the lamp beside the bed was on, but the light flickered oddly, like it wasn't getting enough power. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room. Everything was in its place, except for one thing. On the nightstand next to the bed, there was a single black and white photograph. I didn't recognize the people in the photo, but I could feel my heart rate spike. They were sitting at a table, a man and a woman, smiling at the camera. But what caught my attention was the date written in pencil at the bottom of the photo, August 13th, 1987. The date didn't make sense. The motel had only been open for a few years, and as far as I knew, no one had stayed in room 4 before tonight. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized I had never seen that photograph before, and no one had checked into this room that night. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I whipped around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. I tried to open the door, but it was locked, and the handle wouldn't budge. The air around me grew colder, and the light in the room flickered again, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. A voice, low and guttural, came from behind me. "Leave! Now!" I spun around, but again, no one was there. The walls seemed to close in on me, the room growing smaller and smaller with each passing second. I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on me, something old, something malevolent. The door finally burst open, and I stumbled back into the hallway, gasping for air. My hands shook as I locked the door behind me, glancing back into the room. But it was just a room now, empty, silent. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo, the date, and the voice. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind. Too much exhaustion, too much time alone. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right with that room. The next morning, I did some digging. I checked the motel's guest book and found a reservation for room 4 from August 13th, 1987, the same date on the photograph. The names listed were familiar: James and Maria, a couple who had checked in on that day and never checked out. According to the records, they had both been found dead in that very room, a murder-suicide that had been kept quiet by the police. The case had never been solved, and the room had been sealed off, but for some reason, the reservation had slipped through the cracks. The photo, the date, the voices, it all made sense now. I quit my job that day and left the motel for good. I never went back, and I never looked at a room the same way again. But sometimes, when I pass by the old building, I still hear the faint sound of whispers from room 4, like the past is trying to get out. I had been working the night shift at a gas station for almost a month, and I was starting to get used to the eerie quiet of the late hours. The station was located on a stretch of highway where few cars passed after dark, and it was just me, the dimly lit pumps, and the flickering lights of the small convenience store. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten by time. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd read books, listened to music, and occasionally someone would pull up for gas or snacks. But it didn't take long for me to realize that the place had a strange atmosphere, something unsettling that crept into my thoughts as soon as the sun set. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the building was watching me, like it had a pulse of its own. That night, around 2 a.m., I was in the convenience store restocking the shelves when the bell above the door jingled. I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the headlights of an approaching car. He was tall, wearing a long coat, and his face was hidden beneath the brim of a worn-out hat. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though a shiver ran down my spine. The man didn't answer. He just walked toward the counter, his steps slow and deliberate. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but it was hard to ignore, the way the air seemed to grow heavier with every step he took. He placed a pack of cigarettes on the counter, but when I rang him up, I realized he wasn't pulling out any money. I looked up, expecting him to be reaching into his pocket, but instead, he was staring at me, his face still hidden in shadow. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to break the tension. "You need to pay first." Still no response. I hesitated, glancing at the security camera. Maybe I should call for help, but I didn't want to provoke him. The whole situation felt wrong, and I couldn't explain why. Then, suddenly, the lights above the counter flickered. The hum of the neon sign outside seemed to grow louder. I heard a low thud, like something heavy falling to the floor. I spun around, but the store was empty. The man was gone. I stood there, staring at the spot where he had been, my heart pounding in my chest. The pack of cigarettes was still on the counter, untouched. I grabbed it and put it behind the register, not sure what to do. It wasn't until I noticed the small piece of paper tucked under the pack that I started to feel a growing sense of dread. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and torn at the edges. It had a message scrawled in faded ink. "Don't go outside." I stared at the note for a long time, my mind racing. It was like a warning. I looked out the window, half expecting to see the man standing there, watching me, but there was nothing. The parking lot was empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone and called the manager. He wasn't answering. For a moment, I wondered if I should just leave, but I couldn't. Something told me I had to stay. Around 3:15 a.m., the door jingled again. This time, I didn't turn around. I felt it, the cold breath of someone entering, but I didn't want to face whoever was standing there. I didn't want to acknowledge that this wasn't normal. "Are you okay?" a voice asked. It was soft, almost kind, but it was wrong. I slowly turned around to see the same man standing in the doorway, his face still obscured by the hat. But now, his coat seemed even darker, as though the shadows were clinging to him, growing thicker, swallowing up the space around him. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll know soon enough," he replied, his voice low and rasping. I took a step back, my eyes darting around the room. There was something in the air, something that felt suffocating, like the room itself was closing in. The walls felt too close, the fluorescent lights flickering faster now, casting strange shadows across the store. Then I heard a sound, a scraping, dragging noise coming from outside. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the concrete. Slowly, slowly, closer and closer. I moved toward the window, my legs shaky, and peered out into the darkness. At first I saw nothing, just the empty parking lot and the faint glow of the streetlights in the distance. But then, my eyes caught something, a figure moving in the shadows. It was dragging a long, dark shape behind it. A body? My breath caught in my throat as I saw the figure pause just outside the window, staring up at me. It was the one who had been inside moments ago. He lifted his hand and pressed it against the glass, leaving a streak of something dark, something wet. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing, panic flooding my senses. I turned to run, but as I did, I felt something cold brush against my arm. I spun around, but no one was there. The door jingled again. This time, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat, shoved the cigarettes into my pocket, and bolted out the door. I ran across the parking lot, not looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the road, gasping for air. I glanced back once, just once, and saw the lights of the gas station flicker out, one by one, until everything was shrouded in darkness. I never went back to that place, never again, but sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear that dragging sound again, closer and closer, just outside my door. I had never believed in ghosts, supernatural occurrences, but that all changed one night when I worked the late shift at a small motel located on the outskirts of town. The place had seen better days. The walls were peeling, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the old carpet was stained and worn. But it was a job, and it paid the bills. Most of the time, the shift was uneventful, just me and the occasional trucker or weary traveler passing through. That night, however, was different. It was around 3 a.m. when the first strange thing happened. I was sitting behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine, when the bell above the door jingled. I glanced up and saw a man standing in the doorway, his silhouette cast against the dim light from the parking lot. He was tall, wearing a long coat, and his face was obscured by the brim of a wide hat. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease creeping into my chest. The man didn't respond, but instead walked toward the counter, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I looked at him closely. He didn't appear to be carrying any luggage or bags, just his dark, long coat. I didn't want to be rude, so I greeted him, asking if he was checking in, but he didn't answer. I began to feel uncomfortable, unsure of what to do. "Do you need a room?" I tried again, my voice almost pleading now. Finally, the man looked up, his face still hidden beneath the hat, but his eyes were dark, so dark that they almost seemed to absorb the light around. There was something wrong about them. His gaze pierced through me like a cold wind, sending a chill through my body. The silence stretched on, and then he muttered, barely above a whisper, "Room 13. I blinked, confused. "What?" "Room 13, he repeated, his voice lower. more insistent this time. I tried to brush it off. "We don't have a room 13, I told him, my voice faltering. It was a small motel, and room numbers had always gone from 12 to 14. But before I could say anything else, the man nodded, turned around, and walked toward the back of the motel. I hesitated. There was no room 13. The man was either confused or playing some kind of game, but my gut told me something wasn't right. I went to the window to watch him. He moved slowly across the parking lot, his figure disappearing into the shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. It had to be. I had been working too many late shifts, my mind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like something dragging along the floor. It came from the back of the motel, where room 13 should have been. I froze. The air in the room seemed to thicken, like it was suffocating me. I grabbed the flashlight from under the counter and stepped outside. The parking lot was empty, save for a few parked cars, and the motel was quiet, too quiet. I felt an icy chill seep through my coat, and my breath came out in shaky bursts. I walked cautiously around the back of the building, shining the flashlight ahead of me. There, at the far end, was room 13. It wasn't supposed to exist. I approached the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The scraping sound had stopped, but the air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The room was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of the parking lot outside. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, and the air was stale. Nothing out of the ordinary except for one thing. The room was freezing cold, as though it hadn't been used in years. I stepped further into the room, my flashlight beam flickering as I moved toward the bed. That's when I saw it. Written in red, almost as if it had been smeared on the wall, was a message. "Leave now before it finds you." My heart stopped. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around me. I turned quickly, stumbling backward toward the door. I didn't even think. I just ran. As I burst out of the room, I slammed the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and my chest was tight with fear. That's when I saw the man. He was standing by the far end of the parking lot, facing me. His head was tilted slightly, as if watching me. His eyes were darker now, darker than before. And in that moment, I knew something was terribly wrong. I turned and bolted for the front door, locking it behind me as I collapsed against the counter, gasping for air. The bell above the door jingled again, and I glanced up, my heart in my throat. But there was no one there. The man was gone. I didn't sleep that night. In fact, I didn't sleep for days after that. The next morning, I tried to get in touch with the motel owner to tell him what happened. But when I mentioned a room 13, he looked at me like I was crazy. "Room 13, he said, shaking his head. "There's no room 13, never has been. The building doesn't even have a room with that number." I tried to explain, but he just dismissed me, saying I must have been imagining. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt, and I knew that something had been watching me from that room, something that had been waiting. I quit that night. I never went back to the motel, but sometimes when I drive past, I swear I can still see the shadow of that man standing in the parking lot, waiting. It was my first week working the night shift at a small diner located on a quiet stretch of highway, far from the bustling city. The diner had seen better days. Its once bright neon sign now flickered weakly, and the old linoleum floors creaked underfoot. But the hours were long, and the pay was decent, so I didn't mind too much. It was peaceful, almost eerily so, with hardly any customers coming in after 10 p.m. I quickly learned that the night shift at the diner was always lonely. The occasional trucker would stop by for a cup of coffee or a late-night meal, but most nights I would spend hours alone, listening to the hum of the old fridge and the occasional clink of dishes. But on this particular night, things would be different. It was a Tuesday around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something strange. I was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up expecting another tired traveler, but instead, I saw a man standing in the doorway, his figure shadowed by the dim light outside. He was tall, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. His posture was strange, rigid, as though he had been standing there for much longer than he actually had. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, staring at me from behind the brim of his hat. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though my gut told me something wasn't right. The man didn't answer. He just stepped inside, his boots scraping the floor as he moved toward the counter. His eyes were dark, too dark, almost black, and when he raised his head slightly, I could see his lips curled in a faint, unsettling smile. "Coffee?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. He nodded, his smile widening just a fraction. I quickly poured him a cup and slid it toward him. As I did, I noticed something odd. His hands, pale, thin, almost skeletal, were resting on the counter, but they didn't move. They just remained there, unnaturally still. "Where are you headed?" Trying to make small talk. but he didn't respond. Instead, he took the coffee, brought it to his lips, and took a slow sip, never taking his eyes off of me. The silence between us felt heavy, like something was watching from the corners of the diner. I tried to shake the feeling of dread building in my chest, but it was getting harder to ignore. There was something wrong with this. He seemed too still, too quiet. His movements were deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. Yet there was an urgency to his presence that made my skin crawl. I turned to the register to ring him up, but when I looked back, he was gone. Just like that. One moment, he was sitting at the counter, and the next, he was nowhere to be seen. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced around the diner, but the man was gone. The door was still closed. The bell above it hadn't jingled. I didn't know what to think. Maybe I was just tired, hallucinating. I had been alone for hours after all. But then I looked down at the counter, where his coffee cup had been sitting. It was empty now, but there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. A small folded piece of paper. I picked it up carefully, my hands trembling. When I opened it, I saw the words written in uneven, spidery handwriting. Leave now. It's not safe here. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. I looked around the diner again, but everything seemed still, unchanged. I stuffed the note into my pocket, trying to calm myself down. But the feeling of unease didn't go away. As the night dragged on, I kept glancing nervously at the door, half expecting the man to return. But he didn't. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, and I eventually tried to push the strange encounter from my mind. But as the hours passed, I began to notice something else. The diner felt off. The lights seemed dimmer, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. The fridge buzzed louder than usual, almost like it was trying to drown out the silence. Around 4 a.m., a group of truckers came in. For a moment, I felt a little relief. They were loud, talking about their routes and laughing. But as they sat down in one of the booths, I noticed that they weren't looking at me. They were looking past me, at something behind me. I turned around, my stomach sinking. There, in the far corner of the diner, was the man again, sitting at one of the booths. His long coat was draped over the chair, and his hat was pulled low over his face. His hands were folded in front of him, waiting for something. I tried to ignore the overwhelming sense of dread creeping up my spine, but I couldn't. I didn't want to go near him. I didn't want to acknowledge that he was real. One of the truckers noticed me looking, and he followed my gaze. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his voice a little too loud. I swallowed hard. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, though my voice wavered. But the trucker kept staring, his expression shifting to confusion. "There's no one over there, just us." I turned back to the corner, and sure enough, the man was gone. The booth was empty. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just seen something that wasn't supposed to be there, something that wasn't real. The rest of the night passed in a blur. The truckers left, and I closed the diner alone. But even as I locked the door and turned off the lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally left that night, I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, but deep down, I knew that I had seen something that I couldn't explain. And every night since, I still feel it, the sense that someone is watching me, waiting for me, just outside the diner's doors. It was my third week working the night shift at a small, isolated gas station on the outskirts of town. The kind of place you only stop at if you're desperate for fuel or if you're passing through late at night. The station had a rundown feel to it, with cracked pavement, flickering lights, and a faded sign that hadn't been replaced in years. I hadn't minded it at first. Peace and quiet with minimal customer. Just what I needed. But that peace was about to be shattered in a way I never could have predicted. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something strange. I had been sitting behind the counter, flicking through an old magazine, when I heard the faint hum of a car engine in the distance. It was the only sound in the otherwise quiet night. I looked up, expecting to see a trucker or someone in need of gas. But the car that pulled into the station was different. It was an old, rusty sedan, the kind that looked like it hadn't been on the road in years. The headlights were dim, and the car seemed to struggle as it came to a stop near the pumps. My first thought was that it might break down before they could even fill up, but then, something about the way it parked sent a shiver down my spine. The car wasn't parked in a way that made sense. It was angled wrong, almost as if the driver didn't care or wasn't paying attention. I watched for a moment, wondering if the driver was even aware of how strange it looked. But then, the driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out. He was tall, wearing a long coat that seemed far too thick for the warm weather. His face was hidden by the brim of a wide hat, and I couldn't see any details clearly, but there was something unsettling about him. The way he moved, slowly, deliberately, was almost unnerving. I watched as he walked toward the pumps, but then he did something that made my blood run cold. He didn't stop at the pump to fill up. Instead, He walked straight toward the door of the station. I quickly glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:05 a.m. The station should have been quiet, empty. I had never seen anyone come in at this hour, especially not someone acting so strangely. My heart began to race as the man approached the door. I tried to remain calm, brushing it off as nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me. But the moment he stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, looking at me through the dim light. I stared back at him, my mind racing. He didn't speak. He didn't even move. He just stood there, watching me. "Are you here for gas?" I asked again, my voice more strained this time. But still, he didn't respond. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wanted to call for help, but the phone behind the counter was useless. No one would be able to reach me in time if something went wrong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man reached into his coat and pulled out something, a piece of paper, folded neatly. He extended his arm toward me, holding it out. I was hesitant, but took the paper, unfolding it carefully. On it was a message, written in a rushed, uneven handwriting. "You're next." My blood ran cold. I looked up at the man, but he was gone. The door had silently closed behind him, and there was no sign of him outside. I rushed to the window and peered into the parking lot. The car was gone. The space where it had been was empty. I had no idea how he could have left without me hearing the engine. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just some sick joke, but the words on that paper wouldn't leave my mind. I stood frozen for a long moment, staring out into the dark emptiness. The quiet, the eerie stillness, it was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. For the rest of the shift, I couldn't. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every car that passed by sent my heart racing. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see the old sedan parked out there again, but it never came. The sun finally began to rise, casting a pale light over the station, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I had made it through the night, but when I went to lock up, I noticed something that sent another chill down my spine. The gas pumps were all turned off. I had checked them earlier in the night. There was no reason they should have been off. The switch was located inside, behind the counter, and I had never touched it, but there it was, completely powered down. That was the moment I realized something wasn't right, that maybe, just maybe, the man had been real, and if he was, I was no longer. I finished my shift, left the station, and never went back. But even now, years later, I still remember that. It's etched in my mind. Every night I wonder if the man in the coat is out there waiting for me. And every time I pass by that gas station, I can't help but glance nervously at the parking lot, half expecting to see that old, rusty sedan parked there, waiting for the next person to enter.